Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. And welcome to the Bristol Poverty Institute's interdisciplinary webinar on infrastructure and inequalities. And thank you for joining us. My name is David Gordon. I'm the director of the Bristol Poverty Institute, and we have a fantastic and varied set of speakers joining us today. But before we get to their presentations, I need to do a bit of a brief housekeeping and a brief introduction. Please can you mute your microphones if you've not already done so, and please can you make sure you've added your name rather than just being listed as a guest, so that we can ensure that if you ask questions we know who's asked them. Please also can remember this webinar is being recorded and that by attending you're consenting to this recording and that recording to be made available and shared. We need to do that for data protection and consent requirements. So I'm going to be chairing this seminar today. As I said, my name is David Gordon, and my colleague Joe Gillett will be taking the minutes, and we will produce a report which will be circulated to all the registered participants. And if you don't want your name to be included in this document for whatever reason, then please let us know. Your name doesn't have to be included in the minutes. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Bristol Poverty Institute, or BPI for short, we wanted to provide you with a little background. It was established in 2017 as one of the university's 7 specialist research institutes in recognition of the university's long-term research and strengths in poverty research. The BPI was set up with the ambition of facilitating and driving forward the university's multidisciplinary research in poverty and poverty-related areas in order to inform policy and practice and also to help to improve the methods that we use to measure the theory of poverty. We've launched these series of internal seminars to facilitate networking amongst researchers in the university. Poverty is a multidisciplinary problem and it needs multidisciplinary solutions. So the purpose of these webinars is to stimulate discussion and to forge links between people in different areas of the university who may not be used to working together. And they've, over the past 2 years, been extremely successful in facilitating the development of new collaborations across the university, which have led to some important innovations in policy and practice at reducing poverty. We open these webinars up to select, these internal webinars up to select external entities to add value and also to facilitate collaborations across outside the university. And we're also running these seminar series on a wide range of topics, from conflict to debt to digital exclusion to childhood obesity, all of which have strong and important poverty dimensions, and all of which are important. And of course, infrastructure is no exception. This is crucially important and also an under-researched area about the causes and effects of inequalities and the extension of poverty. One of the major differences in poverty around the world is not just that children, for example, in the UK have richer parents on average than children in, say, Africa or Latin America. It's they also have access to better infrastructure, and it's the value of that infrastructure and the quality of that infrastructure, which is a large part of the resources, which means that poverty isn't so deep in the UK as it is in poorer parts of the world. We're lucky today to have 4 fantastic speakers who are going to introduce us to different approaches and perspectives on how infrastructure and inequalities can intersect with poverty, after which we'll have an open discussion. So I'm going to give the speakers 5 minutes each, which are timed strictly, to provide food for thought and fuel for discussions. And then we'll open up discussions, and encourage everyone who's in this webinar to ask questions and hold a discussion. We won't be taking questions after each individual presentation, but please do make notes of any questions you want to ask a particular speaker. We hope that this webinar will be a catalyst for future discussions, and that discussions will occur after the webinar has taken place, and possibly that will lead to future collaborations and even research bids. So without further ado, we'll open in with our first speaker, Dr. Guess Rosenberg, who is a research fellow in the Department of Mechanical Engineering. Guess investigates how systems approaches, including systems thinking and systems engineering, can be applied to address societal challenges relating to infrastructure and city futures. He's a co-investigator on a research project entitled Tackling Root Causes Upstream of Unhealthy Development, which aims to change the way decisions are made about urban development and prevent non-communicable diseases in the future. So I'm really looking forward to hearing him. Okay, Guess, over to you.
Hello. So my area of research is predominantly infrastructure. That's both soft and hard infrastructure, the soft being the social aspects and the hard, the technical. That comprises digital, physical and social. And it's about how we support society to live and achieve the goals, to live fulfilling lives without damage to the environment. And there's a number of challenges, obviously social challenges, that infrastructure has helped overcome in the past, thinking back to waterborne diseases, and currently airborne diseases, both air quality and COVID are two currently, but also thinking about decarbonisation and equality, the levelling up agenda, I guess. So the sorts of questions that we sort of ask ourselves in infrastructure is, how should we plan and design future cities and their infrastructure? How do we ask the right questions and better engage stakeholders and citizens in the research, planning and development of future cities? And what are the social and economic needs and environmental constraints that we need to address in doing that? So the systems approach is where I do my research. How we approach urban and city futures and infrastructure in a more joined up or holistic way, and how we do boundary spanning. One example project was Urban ID, which was an interdisciplinary project run with UWE, bringing in techniques such as co-production from the education department, learning journeys, and also developing our own challenge framework and adding in the systems approach. And we developed a challenge framework on that comprised mobility and accessibility, plus biodiversity, plus carbon neutral city and environmental quality, health and well-being, and importantly for our discussion today, inclusion and equality. And you'll see similar concepts running out with social impact assessment, environmental impact assessment, SDGs. What we found with the systems approach, we were able to think about it in terms of business as usual and overcoming that, and then giving power to the idea that we can innovate and develop new ways of thinking. The TREAD project itself, Tackling Upstream Causes of Unhealthy Urban Development, is looking at how we plan our cities, the permission we give to developers in city development, and how we use valuable land assets, and what that means for public health and well-being. So the programme is seeking to reduce non-communicable diseases in this particular case, but it's obviously been brought to the attention, public attention, that COVID, through COVID, that there's economic inequality and that impacts on the health of people. And so there's a big correlation between poverty and health inequality. And so we ask ourselves the questions, and we try to develop the methods and tools to support this questioning. Why do we allow trade-offs that compromise public health? Can we understand these, and what interventions can we design to address those sorts of challenges? So in the methods and tools development, we'll be thinking about system dynamics models, or how we can connect up through understanding dependencies and interdependencies and see where problems are caused. So we may be trying to tackle a problem in one particular part of society, but actually the causes are elsewhere. One example was supporting Bath and North East Somerset, South Gloucester and Bristol City Council on the Health Foundation Shaping Places Fund. And the purpose was to develop innovative new approaches to improve public health. As a team, we looked at food insecurity or food poverty, but it very quickly became quite apparent that the causality of food insecurity is linked to digital exclusion, transport poverty, and just the energy poverty and the wider holistic sort of view of poverty. And so trying to understand those interactions leads us to think about how we can improve public transport. And the next stage on that particular project will be to validate the understanding of the models. Those were system dynamics models in that particular case, and how we co-design joined up preventative interventions that will address the necessary and sufficient causes of poverty, not just apparent problems and applying sticking plasters. I could talk about the One City plan and how that has adopted a systems approach, and also how we're thinking about city observatories and living labs. And we'll be looking at using those in the future to tackle decarbonisation and to make that affordable so that everyone can take part in that exercise without excluding people from the decarbonisation programme. I think that's my 5 minutes up, so perhaps I'll stop there, and I hope there's a few thoughts to feed off.
Thank you, and thank you for keeping to time. That was a real, really interesting talk and a lot of fuel for thought. Our second speaker is Professor Sue Parnell, who is Chair in Human Geography in the School for Geographical Sciences. Sue's early academic research was in the area of urban historical geography and focused on the rise of racial residential segregation and the impact of colonialism on urbanisation and town planning in sub-Saharan Africa. Since 1994 and democracy in South Africa, her work has shifted to contemporary urban policy research, which has included a focus on local government, poverty reduction, and urban environmental justice. Her research has been key in documenting how cities respond to policy changes, and I'm delighted that she's agreed to talk to us this afternoon. Sue, over to you.
Thanks, David, and very nice follow on, I hope, from Gez. And I certainly shall try and keep to time, and I may rush a little at the end. I mean, I think what's really useful about this discussion is that I think most poverty specialists are totally familiar with the debates about the shortcomings of income measures. And they're familiar with the sort of associated kinds of bigger debates which relate to income around basic income grants. In other words, they understand both the limits and the centrality of money for the poor. It's a fairly well-established terrain within poverty studies. But for a long time, it seems to me that there have been much less well-developed debates about infrastructure and poverty. And partly because, at least on the left, there was this kind of sense of irritation, concern about the unintended consequences and the limits of basic needs and the kind of big infrastructure projects that the World Bank led in the sort of second half of the 20th century. But as Gez sort of alludes, there's been recently quite a conceptual and a political renaissance, if you like, in infrastructure studies. And poverty specialists are among many who are re-engaging with infrastructure. And I found it quite helpful to sort of think about why. And the first reason, it seems to me, Jonathan, you might have a different view, is about the urbanization of poverty, because basically the poor need infrastructure and its associated services to be accessible and affordable even more than the rural poor do. So with the urbanization of poverty, infrastructure becomes more important. The second is, and again, Gez, you've already said this, is that climate change, where the poor already have unreliable and inferior quality infrastructure, which is, of course, at elevated risk from extreme events, and it's very difficult to replace because it's enormously expensive to get together the kinds of big fiscal questions, puts infrastructure of the poor and for the poor really firmly at the center of the climate change debates. And then I think the third reason why infrastructure has become more important, or appears to have become more important, is actually because of intellectual change. It's because of some paradigmatic shifts. So on the one hand, we have the complexity science that we've just been hearing about, which lends itself to the study of poverty and the poverty infrastructure nexus. But on the other hand, in the social sciences, things like the emergence of critical infrastructure studies has made social scientists more able or aware to deal with the way that spatial configurations and infrastructural configurations shape and are shaped by the material form. And sometimes even infrastructure is not seen only as a material edifice, but something which is a structuring element of society, including relations of inequality. And then finally, there's sort of a resurgence or a bit of a comeback of what I think of as old-fashioned political economy, sometimes now thought of as political ecology thinking, where scholars and activists are both seeking to expose the power dynamics associated with poverty and infrastructure. And that's everything from very big projects like Belt and Road or big dams, right down to much smaller scale infrastructures of the poor, you know, things like incremental housing projects or street making. So some really big changes, all of which lead in the same direction, that things have changed. So changing ideas, changing context, and a changing sense of urgency about infrastructure. And I suppose I want to just use my minutes to sort of ask what that means and what it means for poverty studies. I think, David, you alluded to the fact that it means more interdisciplinary work. So basically, poverty specialists have to begin to engage not just with economists, but with medics and engineers and infrastructure experts. I think it also means that we're going to enter into an even more politicized debate, an ideologically politicized, an intellectually politicized, and an operationally politicized debate about how you deal with poverty and infrastructure simultaneously. And I wanted to come in on the operational stuff, which I think is often seen as really boring and technical, even technocratic. And I want to make the argument that actually it's much more than that. Looking at the dimensions of the operational delivery of infrastructure in a way that makes it pro-poor demands some fundamental rethinking of the state. And I'm drawing here on a book that we put out a couple of years ago now, 2-3 years ago, called The Capable State, that looks at infrastructure and the resulting services, so water, energy, built environment, what I would call built environment services, and the way that they engage and uphold fundamental rights, and in a way that they are configured to ensure or preclude redistribution. Okay, and effectively what we argue in that book, and I suppose what I'm suggesting is that there's an awful lot more work to be done in this space, particularly when we look at the SDGs and the way that many of the SDGs focus on infrastructure questions, to ask about what makes for success or failure. And clearly in 5 minutes, I'm not going to give you all of the answers to that, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of reasons why I think infrastructure can work and what makes it work well for the poor, and in what respects state failure contributes to barriers to infrastructure for the poor. So using the South African case, and it is only a case, we basically argue that actually the post-apartheid government in the 20-25 years after democracy did fairly well in using infrastructure to enhance conditions for the poor, partly because there was strong capacity already in place, particularly in urban areas, and they used that well. The second thing is that they had a system of local government, which was quite strong and powerful, and built environment functions, infrastructure tend to be associated or cannot be delivered without substantial devolution. And finally, there were national departments that focused their attention on municipalities. So in other words, it wasn't just devolution, it was also the commitment to multi-scale government. But as we know, the South African government is not an all, and the South African case is not an entire success. And there's some real lessons for us on where infrastructure can go badly wrong. The most important is that it's very difficult to build infrastructure capacity from scratch, particularly in places which were once rural and have become urban and which don't have systems like taxation, the ability to redistribute, the ability to subsidize in place. Really, really important. The second thing is that where you don't have an organizational capacity, in other words, you don't have skilled people and you don't have institutions, it's very difficult to generate the systems on which the poor depend. And then finally, when national governments are so weak that they cannot support weak local structures, you tend to get very, very weak results on infrastructure in particular. And that's because many of the issues at stake are quite complex. They're not solvable at the grassroots level. They have to do with large-scale fiscal systems, large-scale environmental conditions, and they are vulnerable to conditions of corruption and to political manipulation. And so it's with that in mind that I just wanted to sort of wind up and come full scale and to say, I think there's fantastic work to be done on the space of infrastructure and poverty. Much of it has to do with really dealing with questions of the configuration of the state. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sue. That was a really interesting talk. Our next speaker is Dr. Sam Williamson, who is a lecturer in the Department of Electrical and Electrical Engineering. Sam's research focuses on access to sustainable energy, with a particular focus on renewable energy microgrids and whole energy systems analysis. His research aims to empower and enable communities, large and small, and especially in the international development context, although also, yeah, I hope in the UK context, to be able to support themselves using tools, techniques, and services that are locally available. Alongside other researchers at the university, Sam is co-investigator on the research project entitled Beyond the Network City, Build an Innovative Delivery Systems for Water, Sanitation and Energy in Urban Africa. Thank you, Sam. Over to you.
Thank you, Dave. So I am going to talk about energy access, and I'm going to talk about it through the lens of 3 different projects that we're working on at the moment. And one of them is the Beyond Network City project that Dave mentioned. So just to say, a lot of the work I do is in working with partners in the Global South, looking at energy access, both in urban, in rural situations, and we've recently been over the last couple of years been working in humanitarian situations as well, so looking at displaced camps and so on. So I'm going to talk in those 3 things. I think one thing to just state first of all is I'm part of the electrical engineering department. But when I talk about energy, I'm not just talking about electricity. The 2 things are not one thing. And if you look at how people use energy, actually a large proportion of the energy that people use is, especially in the Global South, is for cooking. And in fact, we use a lot of energy here for cooking as well. But yeah, that's their major energy consumption. And so when we're talking about energy, we're talking about energy itself, not just electricity. And so I guess the first, I'm going to start off looking at rural off-grid situations and trying to think about that. And so I've been working with for the last 15 years or so with partners in Nepal, looking at energy access in rural communities. And Nepal has very large hydropower opportunities. I think, off the top of my head, it's about 83 gigawatts potential, and but 43 gigawatts economically potential, and they're less than 1 gigawatt of actually generated power at the moment from their hydropower systems. But what they have done in a lot of rural communities is there's 3,300 micro hydropower schemes, and so these are able to use local resources to be able to supply electricity and other services to local communities. And this energy is able to then enable these communities to provide services to themselves. And this is one of the key things about energy, that energy provides this service. Sue was mentioning it as well in terms of infrastructure services. And the energy that these services can provide, especially in rural Nepal, a lot of them are agrarian communities, and so you're looking at processing of agricultural products, which then enables an increased income to be able to get from this. This infrastructure cannot necessarily directly be afforded by the community themselves, because they are quite often effectively a cash-free community most of the time. And so a lot of this infrastructure has been supported by development projects and subsidies and so on, but using local resources as well. So using local industry to be able to actually build and construct this infrastructure, which has then enabled local companies to build up and maintain these systems. And so there's a really interesting question around how to support localization of infrastructure rather than sort of globalization of technology and infrastructure, to be able to actually enable maintenance, repair, and continuation of service supply, rather than depending on a sort of a global market around it. And just sort of, I'm going to go into electricity, even though I said electricity isn't energy, so I apologize. But one of the projects in Nepal we've been looking at over the last couple of years is talking about electric cooking, and thinking about how electric cooking can actually support people. So again, a lot of people are using biomass in Nepal. It's about 80% of people that are currently using biomass to cook with. 22,000 people die every year from indoor air pollution, and most of that is because based on biomass cooking. The richer ends of society are able to afford gas. Gas comes at a cost, not only because you have to import it into Nepal because there's no LPG there, but also there is you have to actually take it to wherever you're living as well. And so there are a number of costs, and there's a real poverty question around that. We've been looking at electricity and how electricity is able to supply it and support cooking through this. And we have seen some real impacts in terms of this. One issue is, how do you support the poorer people to be able to, the poorer ends of the spectrum to be able to afford the electricity, because you've got a large amount of energy going into cooking. And that's not something we've been able to sort out. Another big issue is actually generation, and especially in off-grid systems, you don't have enough generation to be able to support all the households to be able to cook. Even if you added a load of storage and sort of smooth out your demand, on a grid where you may be supporting 1,000 households, we've calculated that we can maybe support 250 households currently. And so how do you get enough energy, and how do you integrate multiple different parts of infrastructure, off-grid infrastructure, to be able to enable electric cooking and clean cooking across the whole community as well. Moving on to sort of urban situations, we've been looking at, I say, in the Beyond Network City program, we've been looking at informal communities in Freetown in Sierra Leone and in Kampala, and looking at their energy access. We're just sort of at the beginning process, or we're just, in fact, they should over the next couple of days be starting data collection in Freetown to try and understand this a little bit better. But some of the questions we're looking at here is, in terms of infrastructure, what is better, having a decentralized infrastructure where you have off-grid systems, so you have off-grid electrical systems, you have gas being shipped in, you have and so on, or is it better to have a centralized distribution system to be able to access energy that way? What are the benefits between them, and how does this support the whole range of society being able to access those energy services? And finally, as I'm probably running out of time, just mention quickly the humanitarian space as well. Humanitarian energy has come out over the last couple of years as being a key thing. There are 9 different clusters across the humanitarian response. Energy is not one of them, but most of them actually require energy. I have a PhD student called Peter Thomas, and he's recently published a paper about this. I can give Joe the information to put in the notes later on. But energy is very key to be able to provide a lot of this, a lot of the work that's able to support the humanitarian response. one of the issues with humanitarian responses, quite often governments will not recognise, especially refugees, in terms of as legal people, and so therefore are not willing to invest in infrastructure to supply energy systems to camps. And so getting energy to those camps is very, very difficult and can be very expensive. I had a colleague in Chatham House who explained to me one time how they got diesel fuel from Dar es Salaam to a camp in the north of South Sudan, and they had to drive it across Central Africa. They had to fly it over the marshes in the middle of South Sudan and then get it. This must have been the most expensive diesel ever, you know, and just that supply chain is just not achievable. And so being able to have infrastructure, and again, I think for me, it comes down to a question of localization and understanding what resources are there and being able to use that localization to be able to develop your own infrastructure for that. But there are lots of political and legal barriers to that. And as an engineer, that really frustrates me because it's not a technical problem that I can solve with a spanner and a nut. So yeah, I'm really happy to discuss lots of things afterwards. And I think this is just some food for thought at the beginning. Thanks.
Thanks, Sam. That raised a lot of really important questions, which I hope we'll be able to discuss later. But let's move on to our final speaker, who I'm pleased to introduce to you, Professor Alex Marsh, who is Professor of Public Policy in the School for Policy Studies, who heroically survived 2 terms as head of school and therefore was my old boss, and he managed to survive with most of his faculties still intact, which is also an amazing achievement. Alex has worked in housing policy research and is one of the world's leading experts on housing policy, and much of his research has engaged with issues related to governance and regulation of both social and private rented housing. Alex is a co-investigator of the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence and was part of the EPSRC's International Centre for Infrastructure Futures, where he undertook research on the policy and governance aspects of local and smart cities. Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Dave. Yes, most of them are faculty still intact, you're right. So yes, I'm going to pick up on that last part actually and talk a bit about, rather than talk about housing specifically, talk a bit about smart cities and just say a bit about a project that we're sort of towards the back end of at the moment and draw on that. So at the moment we've got a Newton Fund project based in Mexico called Empowering Citizen-Oriented Smart City Innovation in Mexico, which is fundamentally interdisciplinary. So it's people from policy studies, management, education, civil engineering at Bristol, working in collaboration with colleagues at Anáhuac University in Mexico City. It resonates. Some of the things that come out of that resonate quite strongly with some of the things that Susan was saying. What we're trying, it's part of the Newton Fund Smart Cities program with a particular emphasis on the politics of smart cities. That's sort of what they want to get into. I think it's interesting for those people who know anything about the smart city debate. It's gone in waves, and I'm conscious of colleagues from geography on this call, from a sort of early concern for the sort of corporate smart city and the dominance of private sector tech interest in bringing tech into the cities and the agenda that was sort of perpetuating, a sort of reaction which you said, well, we need to put sort of citizens much more prominently, citizen interests, the issues that concern citizens, the problems they face, sort of front and center. And there's a big literature saying we really should do this. There's quite a lot less literature saying, and this is how you do it successfully. You know, I mean, I think like citizen engagement in urban policy more generally, but layer on top of that sort of a technical component, and it sort of makes the thing more challenging. So what we're looking at, if you like, is we've done work with citizens in Mexico City to think about what their attitudes to tech, etc. So without going through the project in great detail, just I guess some observations about that, things that come out of what we're thinking about is sort of comes out very strongly. We rather than framing this as the sort of entrepreneurial urbanism or the neoliberal city, we're taking a slightly more institutionalist sort of barriers and enablers, sorts of regulatory institutions, normative institutions, you know, type approach to thinking about what's going on. And once we start to do that, we run up against some fairly heavily embedded institutional structures, and the question is, can sort of smart city tech driven projects, techs that aim to assist the poor and aim citizen aim to assist citizens to meet their needs or improve their well-being, run up against some quite interestingly heavily embedded challenges. So if you're starting at the wrong end of the system. Mexico itself is a really interesting case. I'd like to talk to Susan afterwards actually about this in terms of the role of the state. So in the smart city debate, there's been a big push away from double helix, private public partnerships towards something which is quadruple, get the HE involved, get communities involved, something which is broader based. In fact, Mexico's almost gone in the opposite direction. It's rejected helixes entirely and gone for a public sector led innovation strategy, which has become more top down, less inclusive in its orientation towards citizens being part of the process. So it's an interesting case study in that. But what it has done, which I think is quite interesting and we're trying to explore, is it's tried to do things with data. So in a context where there's considerable spatial inequality, social inequality, partly through networks, clientelism, corruption, can the state do things with data to impose more standardized understandings and readings of the city, to think about how resources are allocated between parts of the city, so that you don't, in Mexico, as I'm sure elsewhere, you talk about a two-speed city. You've got a sort of cosmopolitan, connected city of people who are sort of have access to infrastructure and resources. You've got an informal, you've got a sort of peripheral, you've got an insecure, you've got a city where human rights are in question, let alone access to infrastructure. So how do you overcome that? And currently the agency responsible for this is trying to do it at least partly with data. Whether it's succeeding or not is a different question, but it's something actually, if we can impose sort of a rather more bureaucratic, standardized rationality on things, does that help us overcome some heavily entrenched social divisions? So it's an interesting sort of model for using tech in a particular sort of way, which runs up against some difficulties. I think one of the things I pick up on from what Susan was saying is the operational, but particularly the thing I'm exercised by is business models as a really important part of this story. So, for example, in the smart city, say we reject the proprietary. We want open source. We want open data. We want the urban commons. What we don't have is a set of business models that actually support that beyond sweat equity or voluntary effort. You see, we don't like proprietary. We don't like Facebook, Google, Siemens. We don't like them commercializing our data, advertising. That we don't want that model. What is an alternative, sustainable model to run infrastructure systems, for citizens, to assist citizens? That seems to me to be a really big hole in the conversation. I mean, if we think about the equivalent elsewhere in the economy, you say, well, we set up, employee-owned workplaces or cooperatives, but we're still selling things into the system. So if we say we don't want to sell and commercialize the data, we want to do something else. What sorts of models do we need? And that seems to me to be something which is worth exploring if we want to say citizen-led, things which the poor have control over, that citizens are able to shape and own what the system does, and it addresses their problems. Because the final point I make is one of the challenges with smart cities is who's the stakeholders that are involved in projects and pilots, in living labs, and their agendas. Because one of the tensions in the smart city debate is about scaling up or otherwise. I think that's a really interesting question we don't explore. Quite often we set up pilot projects with a view to coming up with solutions which we can scale, which can be commercialized, which can speak to other problems in other places. And the more you do that, the more generic they need to be. Whereas on the other hand, if you say, let's start with a community, it's problems in context, tailored solutions to that problem. The more you do that, the less it transfers or can be transferred, because the more it addresses a particular set of contextual issues. And that's a perennial tension in this discussion. Is small scale acceptable, if you like, and is small scale sustainable? It deals with a community's problems at a particular point in time, and nobody wants it to do anything else. Is a position which is quite hard to sustain in the smart cities conversation, because the question is, well, how do we exploit this more broadly? How do we scale it up? Who can commercialize it? So that question seems to me to be one where we could do with a lot more attention. And what we're doing at the moment is thinking about that in relation to NGOs and platforms and supporting the capacity of the civil society. In Mexico City, that's very fragmented. There's lots of civil society organizations that don't communicate. Their idea of innovation is learning how to use commercially available software more effectively rather than innovating something super high tech, but there is no infrastructure. There's no Council for Voluntary Organizations, there's no VOSCA, there's nothing that sort of allows them to exchange and meet and understand each other's problems and how to deal with them. So that's where we're thinking. So can we use platforms in a different way? But it comes right back to this question of what's the model that keeps it sustainable? I'll stop there.
Thank you, Alex. That was raised some really important points, and there are four fantastic speakers with a lot of very interesting ideas, which are a lot of food for thought. Before I open up to the floor for questions, I wanted to do a roundtable introduction so that everyone knows who each other is and what your particular interests are. I will do it in the order, I'll call on people in the order of which I can see you on the screen. So please could you unmute when I say your name and say a little bit about yourself and your interest in this area of research. So the first person I can see is Jitendra. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm in Department of Civil Engineering. Jess knows me very well, and Sam. My particular interests are in the structural and infrastructural safety, and the kind of things I've been doing is identify the most vulnerable parts, whether that be structure or an infrastructure, and then how we can protect these. A couple of projects I could mention. One with Sam on this Beyond the Network City project. The other we are involved with is seismic resilience of schools, where we are not just focusing on the school buildings, but the society and the community who make use of this. And we have taken this project to Malawi more recently.
Thanks. The next person I can see is Sajida.
Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you all. I think I'm probably the newest face here, so I'll just introduce myself quickly. I am a lecturer in population health sciences in Bristol Medical School, and I work with Helen Lambert in anthropology and global health. It's great to be here. My own research, so I wear two hats. My one hat is working with Helen on developing a MSc Global Health project and MSc program, along with working on various projects related to global health and health and healthcare. And then my own research, I work at the University of Sussex in the School of Global Studies, and I work largely on the area of labour migration, transnational labour migration, health and healthcare access in the context of Sri Lankan migration to Kuwait. So I was really interested in getting to know more people working at the intersections of infrastructure and poverty, because it intersects quite a lot with issues of healthcare access. So in my research, both in the context of rural and urban Sri Lanka, systems of inaccess to health are at the moment shaping inaccess to international migration, because the infrastructures are just not in place right now to be able to facilitate health surveillance, which then enables migration regulations to be able to migrate to the Arab Gulf. And then in Kuwait, you would think that it's a glitzy city where all the infrastructures are in place, but there are these, it's a very unequal city. Definitely not a smart city by any means, where there are pockets of poverty and pockets of zones of exclusion where there's just no water, no electricity being cut off because people can't be, migrants aren't able to pay rent, and incredibly poor transportation. So poor people are either poor migrants or low wage migrants are dependent on very poor public transport or no public transport in the context of COVID lockdowns, where, so yeah, a lot of these issues are not just because of COVID. Obviously they're systemic and they've been there for decades, but COVID is bringing them to the fore. So there are a whole bunch of issues that intersect with infrastructure, but I'm an anthropologist by training, and I constantly run into areas that I just don't have the expertise to sort of address. So, a lot of the debates in Kuwait right now about privatizing the healthcare system, which has been public for the past few decades and quite universal, run around issues of costs and issues of, well, we just don't have enough people, we don't have enough hospitals, we don't, this used to be a desert, and where they're literally building new hospitals in the middle of these desert areas. So how as anthropologists and social scientists do we work together with those who are working on those infrastructural aspects of it, but also, as Susan and Alex have highlighted, governance related issues and equality related issues of these things. So I will stop there, but really great to meet everyone, and thanks for giving us the chance to share a bit about what we're doing.
Thanks. Next person I can see is Lauren Winch.
Hello everyone. I think most of you know who I am, but I'll introduce myself just in case. So my name's Lauren Winch, and I'm the manager of the Bristol Poverty Institute. So working with Dave on all of our institute activities. So things like I designed the seminar series and the events within it. So if you've got any ideas for future seminars or any of the projects that people have mentioned so far, if you'd like us to add those to our website to help you with promotion, same with things like publications, or if you've got any other ideas of how the Bristol Poverty Institute might support your work or help you to promote anything, then I'm probably the person to get in touch with.
Thanks, all. Next is Jonathan Rigg.
Yes, hello everyone, and nice to meet you. So I'm a colleague of Sue's. I'm in the geography department. Sue is urban Africa, and I, if you like, I'm rural Asia. So I've worked in Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and Nepal on livelihoods, mobility, rural-urban relations. And in terms of this session, I've always been interested in roads and what roads do, right from when I did my PhD in quite a remote area of Thailand, and then more latterly in Laos, where getting around was really difficult. So I've been interested in roads. And more recently, the Belt and Road Initiative. So I've been working in Laos on the BRI, and we're also looking at the BRI in Nepal. So that sort of massive Belt and Road Initiative effort of the Chinese government. So that's me. Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's very interesting. I've got a PhD student looking at the Belt and Road and poverty. So I might put her in contact with you if that's okay. Next is Lauren Blake.
Hi everyone, I'm another geography member and colleague of Sue's and Jonathan. So I'm a lecturer in human geography. I joined the school a couple of months ago. My background's in anthropology and human geography, and my focus is on agri-food systems more broadly. And I've worked in particular in various parts of Latin America and UK as sort of the areas I've focused on. In terms of some of the relevance to today, so I mean, I've looked quite a lot at issues of inequality and poverty and development. So that side of the sort of inequality side is a fairly given, but also what I love about food systems is, or food generally, is that you can look at almost any issue through that lens and find all kinds of problems and interesting tensions and dynamics and so on. And I really enjoy taking a systems approach. So that it kind of guides us. And so, yeah, you kind of can't look at, I don't know, I see that infrastructure equally affects sort of agri-food systems. It's not an area that I particularly have focused on within my research, but it's one that I'm interested in, and that's sort of why I was attending today.
Thanks. Next is Alba Lamu.
Hello everyone. So yes, I am a researcher at the Center for Demographic Studies in Barcelona. I do research mostly in poverty with a focus on child poverty lately. And I am also a Bristol alumni. And so I've been doing some work with Dave, for example, recently, and on like poverty in the South Pacific, for example, and precisely in working in like how to conceptualize and understand poverty in like small island states and in places where it's really kind of like hard to access services and to reach the population, etc. we started developing with Joanna Mack and Sean Landy kind of an approach to include access to services, and by this I include both infrastructure, things like hospitals, schools, but also like transport, etc. So very related to what we're talking today, into poverty measures. And right now I'm trying to translate that into something that could be applied to the European context, and also try if it can help us understand the impact of austerity on essentially poverty in Europe. Thank you.
Next person I can see is Jamie Evans.
Okay. Yeah, hi everyone. So I work in the Personal Finance Research Centre, and we're based within the geography department. So I joined kind of out of general interest, I guess, today. But actually, I think there were kind of a few overlaps, I guess, with I think particularly what Alex was talking about business models. We do a lot of work on access to cash and financial infrastructure, I guess, mainly in the UK. We're kind of thinking about there are quite a lot of different business models which are kind of emerging over time. We're seeing more shared bank branches and stuff like that. And people think about new ways of providing infrastructure, particularly in, I guess, more deprived communities, which are often left behind in terms of the infrastructure that they have in the kind of financial world. That's the kind of general pattern you see. But yeah, I don't know. It's just generally interesting. So yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks. And last but not least, Joe, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone. Yes, nice to be here. I'm a senior administrator who started in the BPI last month, and so yeah, I kind of echo. I work closely with Lauren and Dave, and so yeah, to echo what Lauren was saying, if there's any ideas to help kind of further facilitate interdisciplinary working, or you have ideas for blogs or other ideas, then yeah, I'd also be interested in, I work closely with Lauren, so you can keep in touch with me as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. That's great. Okay, so I'm going to now open the floor for discussion. Please either type your name into the chat window or raise your hand on the reaction button and unmute and ask your questions. Do we have any questions for the speakers? Okay, I'll start with the first question to get it kicked off. One of the problems of infrastructure is, although it's absolutely crucial, and when you look at the UK's national accounts, the value of housing, education services, transport services are to the poorest 20% are far greater than government cash transfers or any of the social security. That's one of the reasons for the big differences in poverty between different countries, although the value of services and value of infrastructure is hardly ever measured and not measured very well. When they're big infrastructure projects such as, I don't know, HS2, which is costing billions, or flood defences, the pro-poverty or lack of pro-poverty is tends not to be part of the discussion of the business case. It's completely invisible. A few academics like Glenn Bramley have looked at different services to see if they're pro-poor or not, and found a huge mix. He's also did some work for the government of Wales, so they asked him to look at where money was flowing to local areas and where infrastructure was in local areas. That came up with some dramatic findings showing the inequity of infrastructure and the inequity of cash flows. but the report was so horrific it just got shelved and gathered dust. So I wondered what the speakers' views were about how linking poverty and inequality, which has been, some of you have mentioned, has been highlighted by the pandemic, to infrastructure and decisions about infrastructure funding and where money should be spent and what infrastructure is needed.
David, I'm happy to have a stab at that. I mean, other than to say that for me, this is absolutely fundamental. I mean, it was fascinating, and I'm going to again use a South African cameo on it. Nattrass and Seekings did a really interesting book on reducing inequality, and they looked at housing, health transfers, and education transfers and social grants. And that was how they defined what anti-poverty action was. And we had quite a heated debate which flowed from that, which was really about, can we compare the cost of those investments relative to the cost of infrastructure? And what you find is that for most countries, the cost of infrastructure is significantly greater, significantly. And if you include any places where housing, where there's a housing element to it, that is greater still. And yet in the kind of poverty world, that stuff is excluded. And if it does get included, it only gets included at the point of the budget, which is really about direct subsidies. And so, Jamie, it's great to have a finance person here, because it does seem to me, Dave, that one of the things we need to be able to do is just to have a much better understanding of the entire process of the, not just the design of infrastructure. Does it suit poor people in terms of where they can get on and off? And does it address the needs of women? And are the elderly catered for? That stuff's really important. But so too is the way that the financial package is structured. You know, is it being paid for out of taxes? You know, that clearly poor people pay a whole lot more for, because they're paying out of general sales tax or anti-poor taxation strategies. And so just having a kind of the ability to think about infrastructure and understand the points at which it is important for the poor to know or to interests of the poor. The poor themselves don't necessarily have to do this. And I think that's where we struggle in the academy, because the last decades we've got so used to saying unless poor people speak for themselves, it's not a valid interface. The truth is that we do need specialist knowledge about poverty in large systems like infrastructure, or we will not identify key points at which anti-poor decisions are made, which have very long-term consequences. Because the point about infrastructure is that it's not just for the life of the infrastructure, because it gets embedded in space. And so it lives on after that. So I would kind of underscore that way. I don't have the skills myself, other people do, but absolutely, it's really, really fundamental.
Does anyone else want to address that question?
I'd make a few observations about infrastructure. I think one of the things that we've noticed, and I've certainly noticed in Bristol when doing the research, is the big infrastructure projects, fine, you know, they're put in, and it's about connectivity, and you have to be able to afford to use those. And you're probably going to move around the countryside and you're going to commute if those jobs are going to pay you to do that. But what's also lacking, and I think, is the localized connectivity. So we put the big stuff in, but we don't connect up. So when we put the Metrobus into Bristol, we don't think about how people are going to get to the Metrobus. You don't put the cycle racks in, you don't put the small bits of infrastructure that you need. And it'll be the same with, you know, with high speed too. It was done originally, the business case was done on, you know, effectively we needed another radial route out of London because basically people were, there was a donut effect. Unless you got on before Milton Keynes, you'd never get a seat. So you needed more capacity, but then it morphed into a travel cost, and it was all done around the Department for Transport's financial value that it puts on travel cost time. And then that didn't really work out very well, and they had to change those. I forget what the numbers were, but they basically revised down the travel cost loss, because actually it was based on business people traveling and doing no work on a train, which was obviously nonsense. And anyway, they realized they had to change that. So it was changed again, and there was talk about wider economic impacts, and the Economist did some work around that. But unless those wider economic impacts then are all around sort of businesses and the more affluent parts of society, and unless you have that local connectivity, it's all meaningless for people of lower means. So they, again, kind of lose out. And I think that's a real problem. And what we're seeing as well is the health impacts. And that's what the Trude project's about, is that health is also not included in any of the Green Book calculations that are done. So health is also something that's overlooked, and another inequality that is writ large.
They're important points. Yeah. Jitendra?
Yeah, I have the same observation Jess has just made, and this is about the Indian transport infrastructure. Over the recent years, I've observed new highways being built, but then that local connectivity is completely missing. And as a result, what the damage is being done to these new highways so that the local people can get access to. So I think, yeah, that joined up thinking, that systems approach needs to come in. I mean, some of these communities can't even access health infrastructure.
Okay. Are there any other questions, Alex?
So I was just going to pick up on something, sorry, that Jess said there, and about the sort of calculations, and the HS2 is a classic example of that. But there's one of these things. It's one of these things that I always sort of puzzle about with infrastructure, because what's the right terrain on which to have the discussion, if you see what I mean? So by which I mean, you say, well, okay, the HS2 case, you counted business people's time on the trains, they weren't doing anything. That's, so what's the right calculation? You know, whose well-being should be entered into that? You know, what's the right metric to do it? So you're on a sort of Green Book economistic notion, and the more you say, well, we need a broader sense of well-being, we need to weight, you know, we need to weight the, you know, benefit to the poor, you know, more heavily than the benefit to the rich in order to be sort of pro. But all you're doing is you're sort of technicizing political decisions. You're going, well, actually, I'm going to make this a sort of technocratic calculation, but embedded in it is a whole set of value judgments about what's important. But it's almost like we've moved to, in policy making to terms, you've moved to say, well, unless you frame it in that sort of technocratic fashion, you're not getting anywhere. But it sort of constrains the debate in particular sorts of ways. It would be more candid, it would be more honest if you just went, actually, that's not the important thing. So, you know, a rights-based one, or a principles-based argument, or an argument on another terrain, which says, well, yeah, we have to have an eye to the money, but some parts of what's important about these investments is not quantifiable in a metric that is going to jump over the Treasury's sort of threshold for a rate of return over the next 20 years or something. But nonetheless, it is something which is of value. But it's almost like we never want to quite have those arguments in those terms, and then we say, well, okay, well, we need to have a weighted cost benefit analysis that sort of tweaks the formula in ways that benefit certain sorts of people, and then we get the answer we want, which is pro poor investment. But it's a political argument dressed up as a sort of as a calculation, you know.
I think you're very right, of course, and I hope no one thought I was arguing for
no, of course not.
The economic appraisal approach that we currently use. And certainly one of the things that is happening on Trude is actually guys at Bath are doing a model that will internalize the current externality of health impacts. And so there's some sort of questions I have around that. But it becomes just a question of what's the weighting and scoring, and how do you just do the sums, turn the handle, and, you know, what's your discount value and how many years you're going to do this for. And it's And certainly if you look at the infrastructure in the UK, we've got aging infrastructure that was put in place in the Victorian times. And so, you know, the whole discount value of do you do it over 50 years? Well, it's nonsense. High speed 2 will be there way beyond 50 years because it's a linear real estate that's going to have a purpose and we're going to sustain it. So it's going to, you know, go on. But I think that the debate about high speed 2 then took a turn as well, because people started to say, well, why are we doing high speed 2? Why not the, you know, local connectivity? And why don't we open up local railway lines and so on? So, you know, it's a question of what you do with the money, as well as the you know, and the value you get and where do you get the most value. And I think the other thing you see, again, is we're stuck within this sort of legacy. And unless we can challenge that, talking to people about cycle networks in Bristol as an example, because we have existing road networks, people either don't cycle on them because they're busy, or they do cycle on them because they're okay to cycle on, but we still don't know where people would want to cycle. That we're constrained by what we have already. And I think that then replicates patterns of existence. And that's something, again, that's, you know, I don't think well understood, and needs to be looked at.
That raises a really important point, I guess, about updating old infrastructure and introducing new infrastructure. And I had a question about how we can get better systems thinking to look at the holistic problem. One problem that's going to emerge in, say, in the UK is the government has given permission in 2025 to switch off the landline telephone system. There's been no public debate. If you go on BT Openreach website, there's one page saying it's going to be marvelous, everyone's going to be happy, but it means that half the population that have a landline telephone system will no longer work. The several million emergency phones in elevators, lifts will no longer work. The several million emergency alarms that older people carry in case they fall over will stop working. There seems to be no plan at the moment, apart from something on Ofcom saying it will be fine. The market will provide to solve all these problems. How do we get the kind of holistic thinking that would actually solve this emerging problem that's going to come in just 4 years' time to actually be considered, rather than just boosterism that we have at the moment and lack of public debate?
David, and I think Sam's going to come in, but just quickly to say that I think that one of the things you've got to be very careful of there is that the way that you think about that in places where there is good or bad old infrastructure is very different from, but collective infrastructure is the same and different from the way that you think about it in places where the only infrastructure that is there is small scale household level. But where you then face issues of kind of how do you scale up? So I think, you know, introducing a discussion about managing the temporality of infrastructure for the poor and of managing the scaling of the infrastructure for the poor are two of the ways that you do that, to generalize the problems so that at least we have a language, not to solve it in a big meta way, but so that we develop a way to talk about what the problems are.
Alex?
I think all I was going to say was that there's a similar issue in energy as well, where the government has come out and said no gas boilers installed from 2025, and in fact, if you look at transport as well, you know, I can't remember when they've said no more petrol diesel based vehicles from now. But then there's none of the infrastructure investment that is required to be able to support those changes to net zero. If you look at the amount of energy that's, you know, required for heating and required for transportation, where do they expect that to come from for a net zero future? You know, if they're looking at hydrogen, if they're looking at electricity, the electricity infrastructure is sagging as it is at the moment. You know, we're even with the sort of COVID levels of electricity generation, you know, and so there's a lot of I guess ambition with policy that's going on, and it's pointing in the right direction, but there's no discussion about that. There's no discussion about how to get to that point. I feel within, and again, these are not necessarily, well, these are technical implications, but not necessarily technical problems that come out of this. And I think this is where the interdisciplinarity comes into it as well. And when you make those shifts as well, then how do you cover the whole range of society? How do you make sure that if we're all having EVs, how do you make sure that you've actually got somewhere to charge your car outside your house or whatever else? I live in a terrace. There's no way to charge my if I had an EV. There's no way to charge a car here. There's no each car might require, I don't know, 10 kilowatts outside their house, which is double the amount that each household is connected with in the first place. So again, there's a huge amount of investment that is required to be able to achieve these targets. But there's the government says the market will provide. I don't see it providing at the moment. I don't see the market believing that this is actually going to happen in the first place. So yeah, it's a very strange thing for me. Yes, Jeff.
I was just going to sort of build on that. I think Sue's point about legacy infrastructure or large scale versus small scale. I mean, I think I would say, putting my housing hats on and building on Sam's point, it's sort of slightly worse than that, in the sense that that certainly in the UK at the moment you can get planning permission to build new properties that will need retrofitting by the time the standard comes in, and you go, well, I mean, which is sort of absolutely bizarre, so they're not forcing new build properties to actually come up to the standards they've already set, for a few years' time. It's what is going on? That's that, and it's partly, but it's partly, I say, because it's private sector will be providing, it's partly about keeping them affordable and all this sort of thing. So you go, well, so we'll build properties that are sort of affordable now, knowing that people who can just about afford them now are going to get hit with a retrofit bill in the not too distant future. So it's very, very, very peculiar. I mean, another one on that would be something like setting energy efficiency standards for private renting. We're doing some work on that. We say, well, actually, after a certain date, you're not going to be able to let a property below a certain standard. And the government hasn't got a very clear idea how many properties are below that standard at the moment, or whether landlords are going to pay to get them up to the standard. So in the not too distant future, a reasonable sized chunk of the stock will become unlettable legally if you're not careful. And so joining up, I think, is really, really important, because that is mostly poor quality stock for relatively poor people. When energy efficiency is pretty poor, old 19th century terraces and things which are drafty, single skin walls, all this sort of thing. The cost of bringing them up to a standard is going to be probably be prohibitive in many cases. But they haven't thought, well, what are we going to do with the people now when we can't let these properties?
Other questions?
I wonder if I can ask a question, David. Two kind of, big questions. Is it possible to have too much infrastructure? So and too much in terms of density, or too many different types? So I had that kind of question building on some of the things you said. And the other thing is, with this debate, is this debate different from, I mean, I know, most of Sue's work's been in Africa. We've obviously got people working in Bristol, but we're talking about infrastructure and poverty at a global level. So I'm wondering, when you actually ask these questions in Mexico, in South Africa, in Laos, do they take a different form? So do they change from a qualitative point of view? So that, in a sense, talking about infrastructure and poverty has to be context aware. And actually the nature of the relationship changes according to the country, where we're asking the question. So they're two rather different questions, but wondering whether any of the speakers would like to reflect on those.
Sue?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Both provocative. Yes, we do have too much infrastructure. I mean, anybody who's ever looked at any budget knows that transport infrastructure gobbles up absolutely everything, and we don't want it, and yet we're still paying for it. We're partly paying to maintain stuff that was invested later, but it's just, you know, so making the political, and frankly, we could take away a lot of transport infrastructure. We'd certainly affect the rich, but probably not the poor very much. So removing infrastructure may well be a pro-poor strategy, but it's difficult politically. But I think I wanted to come to your question about context. Yes, of course, context matters, but I think for me, the reverse is also true. Which is to say that I think we spent a lot of time, rightly, and we mustn't stop doing it, talking about local specificity, about ensuring that we have appropriate voices and representations of poor people, that organizations of the poor are included and articulate, that we understand the unintended consequences of local contexts, all of those things. And I absolutely endorse each one of those things. The problem is that we haven't spent any time, almost, talking about large scale, big overarching structures and dynamics that would make a difference at scale. Okay, and so for example, we haven't had a 21st century version of the welfare state. Possibly the thing about kind of, you know, some of the debates about social protection, I think, go in that direction, but we basically haven't. And we do have an opportunity to do that, I think, partly via the revised interest in climate change, and partly by some of the revised interests in discussions about financing. And so what we mustn't do is position those in an antagonistic way from the bottom-up discussions. But what we absolutely have to start doing is having a more ambitious discussion, which provides the kinds of people who we need to be able to bring specialists together to have exactly the complex systems discussion on what will make a difference at scale in poverty and infrastructure. And I don't think that we've done that. So, and one of the questions might be, do we have too much infrastructure?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I think possibly we have the wrong infrastructure. So we undoubtedly have not enough of the right infrastructure, and I think we probably have too much of the wrong infrastructure, and that's because our needs change, or we recognise that, you know, needs have changed. So we're obviously going to revamp our energy infrastructure. We got too much of the wrong of that, clearly, and that needs to go. We've also probably got too much competing infrastructure, and I'd agree in transport we've got, you know, trains and motorways competing, and road haulage and the rest of it competing with rail. And we're going to have to, I think there's an opportunity with decarbonisation to rethink the infrastructure, but I don't see a lot of thinking going on, unfortunately. I think there's a lot of targets and there's a lot of thinking about how the economy needs to change, but I don't see a lot of thinking going on about, well, what is the actual, what do we need, and what is a parsimonious infrastructure network that will serve. And as I say, you know, I think local connectivity is quite lacking as well. I think digitalization will be another area where there will be an oversupply of certain types of infrastructure because the market will, you know, benefit that, and there'll be cherry picking will go on. Areas where actually, yeah, we want plenty of 5G in this area because they can afford to pay for it, and will not bother implementing it as quickly in another area because there isn't the financial business case. And so I think Alex's comment about business models, the idea of localization and how big will that become, or will we all still be whizzing around the place? Where will things be made? I think these are the sorts of questions, and they'll determine the answers of what type, where, and how much infrastructure will we need in the future. And they're big questions to be asked, and they will again create winners and losers, wealth and poverty.
Any other questions? I think that's a really important point. Okay, one thing I wanted to move on to is the pandemic. At the moment, the excess deaths estimates are that over 10 million people have died across the world. It's unlikely with the vaccine rollout, even though the first billion AstraZeneca have been produced, it's unlikely the pandemic will end before 2023. We've seen many people die across the world, and we'll never know how many, just because of a lack of oxygen concentrators and a lack of medical care system infrastructure. things which are not particularly expensive to build. They're just in the wrong place, or they simply haven't been bought. Even in the UK, we know that in the poorest areas, you're twice as likely to die or be hospitalised with COVID than in the richest areas. And amongst the younger population of working age, you're 4 times more likely to be hospitalised or die. And a lot of that is due to transport infrastructure, housing infrastructure, lack of open spaces. What do you think the pandemic gives an opportunity to get infrastructure moved up the debate, and particularly the unequitable distribution of infrastructure, and particularly as it impacts on health? It's obviously the pandemic has highlighted it, but the social determinants of health work has shown for many years the relationship between infrastructure and health, particularly in developing countries with fuels and lack of roads and lack of power. But also the pandemic has highlighted it in the richer parts of the world. So what opportunities do you think there are given by the pandemic for stimulating this important debate and important work in this area? One of the speakers want to volunteer?
Well, I'd say that it clearly has gone up the political agenda. How much and how quickly it can be delivered. And I think we always see a sort of pattern of action, and then things get forgotten and lost in time. So when we see infrastructure develop, we put it in, and then it'll be pruned and trimmed back. So we put things in, we put functions in when we design infrastructure, like the local rail networks, and then it gets trimmed back, it gets leaned, and so talking about business models at some point in the future, and things that we put in now will become opportunities for cost savings in the future. So the question is, if you want to take an enlightened view, what's the life cycle over which you want this investment to operate? And do we need to think about airborne diseases in terms of when is the next zoonotic airborne disease? Not just this one, but let's then take a longer term view. I think that would be my view. And I mentioned waterborne diseases and contrasted with airborne diseases, because I think we sort of solved for the long term largely waterborne diseases in developed countries. In developing countries, not. And and a lot of effort really should be going into that, but we're not really doing that. So again, I think it will be about global politics and political power and political decisions. And engineers can come up with ideas, but until the investment and until there's the political will to do these things. So it's over to others to comment on that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and have a slightly, not contradictory to what Kez is saying, but a slightly different view. And Sujay, I'm not sort of talking at you. My one concern with this is that I think there's a huge opportunity, but we've missed it because we've put our faith in biomedical responses to the pandemic. And frankly, until we actually go back to an understanding of public health that is absolutely integrally connected to public infrastructure, you're not actually ever going to put in the mitigation that you require to prevent another pandemic and to address the interests of the poor. And it's fundamentally in the interests of the poor to articulate that connection. So don't hear me wrong, but there's a part of me that is sad that we have found such effective vaccines so quickly, because had we not, we would have been forced back into starting to think about things like, actually, how do we manage food markets? How do we manage food distribution systems? What's the relationship between the quality of sewage and sanitation and public health? And actually, I think that that's the discussion that we really need to start pushing. So for me, I mean, I'm an urbanist, right? So the question of urban health and urban public health is absolutely fundamental. But I would actually, the people I would be pushing are not the engineers. The engineers are enlightened on this thing. They know what to do, they can do it, and they can deliver. The people who are really behind on this are actually the health people. And the sooner we can start getting some of the health people to re-engage on some of the fundamental kinds of questions and not just worry about access to particular kinds of medical care, but to look at the relationship between health and the city, health and the settlements, then I think we'll actually begin to get there. So, yeah.
May I just jump in very quickly? No, I absolutely agree with that point, and I think that the fundamental thing that the pandemic has highlighted are long-standing structural inequalities in access, not just to healthcare, but to basic issues of sanitation, housing, energy. So these, a vaccine in itself cannot solve the issue. I would say that hand in hand with the vaccine, I mean, and I think they're finding that out right now, that no matter how many people you vaccine, if the sewage systems are not working and people don't have the right to sort of move around, then, the vaccine is only going to do so much to sort of handle these issues. So I think the fundamental question isn't so much, I mean, I see what you mean, that the people who are working in health need to sort of see the broader issues, but at the same time, they're not necessarily equipped to deal with these politicized debates. And health and healthcare itself is politicized. It's always been politicized, and the pandemic has made it more politicized. And I think this is where social scientists, anthropologists, geographers, sociologists need to sit down with people who are working with vaccine development and healthcare to sort of help them understand the power dynamics around things. Because if we can't even sort these power dynamics out in normal times, non-crisis times, then how are we, that's kind of the fundamental thing. So I think that I don't think the opportunity has been missed completely. I think the opportunity is still there because the deaths are still so high, and we still are so much, we haven't seen the end of this crisis. So I think that urgency, the current urgency, still creates that opportunity for the conversations to continue, including like in northern contexts where you have contexts where refugees and people with no legal status can have access to healthcare and vaccines. We're seeing that because of historical marginalization and fear of accessing these symptoms, they're simply not feeling like they can access. So long-standing issues of power and mistrust of governments and states, in northern contexts, as well as in a lot of global southern contexts where human rights issues are just sort of thrown out the window and then in the name of trying to control the population. So yeah.
Alex, we're only got a few minutes left, so you I'll have to wind up. Yes.
I'll just follow up a couple of things on that. Two things just struck me. One is the political systems, are rapidly forget. So there seems to be there is a role. This issue about temporality, and there's a role in remembering. So in the UK context, last year we had everybody in. Street homelessness was dealt with in a matter of weeks. Everybody off the streets, and so if governments put their mind to it, they can do things. But they'd rather now forget about that and say, oh no, homelessness is a problem. It's a different type of problem. And I think there's something about keeping these things on the other dimension to the have we missed the opportunity, which has just struck me, and it goes back to the systemic thing, is the labour market effects of the pandemic as well. Because it strikes me that what we've seen is, living circumstances that people tolerated when they were mostly out of the house, working or socializing externally, and you come home and you're sharing, 5 people to a one room, HMO type thing because it's too expensive to do anything else, becomes intolerable when you've got to all be at home at the same time and you haven't got a living room, or whatever. So it seems to me the question becomes, what happens to the labour market in the future? Does it return? Does it bounce back to what it was when we're all going into the office 5 days a week? Or if we end up with different models in the labour market, does the pressure continue to say, well, actually, we need different types of living arrangements? The things that we put up with before are no longer tolerable. So that seems to me to be a bit of an unknown at the minute in terms of whether there's a longer window of opportunity to sort of argue for change, which we're only just going to discover over the next few months, I guess.
Okay, I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop the discussion there. I think it would go on for some time. It's been really fascinating. I'd like to thank our 4 amazing speakers and for all the participants for this very stimulating and interesting debate. As I said, we're going to circulate a brief summary of this event to all the attendees, and we're very keen, of course, to hear about any subsequent conversations you have or collaborations you form based on this webinar. We'll also upload the webinar recording to the website, so you can go back and revisit it if there are any points you missed or wanted to go back to. And also, if you want to tell colleagues who weren't here about the webinar and they want to see what the discussion was. So thank you very much once again, and it's been an amazing session, and I hope you'll join with me in thanking the speakers. Have a good afternoon.